رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه أما بعد السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. Welcome to our discovery journey, how Islamic civilization and sciences impacted the West. This is the second part. The first part focused on the attitude of Europeans toward the legacy of Islamic civilization and sciences. And in this part, we will cover, inshallah, the European Dark Age and the rise of Islamic civilization and sciences. And our interest to cover the European Dark Age because it provides a context to which Islamic civilization started. And I would like to start with the split of the Roman Empire, because I had to make a decision, where do I start? And I think this would be a good point to start. So towards the end of the classical period, and I describe what is a classical period in part one. We're talking about the period 500 years before the Common Era, before the arrival of Prophet Isa alayhi salam, and 500 years after. So towards the end of that classical period, the Roman Empire, it became too large, to manage, to rule or to be ruled, because it covered almost, the whole of Europe, part of Africa, in North Africa, and part of Asia. So by the 3rd century, there were a lot of problems within the Roman Empire. Some of the problems were social, some economic, political, and even military problems. And there was this fundamental cultural difference between the western part and the eastern part. First of all, they spoke different languages. They even believed slightly different, because the West was a Catholic and the East was Orthodox. And there were a lot of brown people in the eastern part, as opposed to Caucasians in the West. So all of these compile into problems. So in the beginning of the 4th century, Emperor Diocletian decided to split the empire into 2 parts. So the western part was centered around Rome, and the eastern part was centered in Constantinople, what is today Istanbul. So practically it was still one empire, but it was delegated to 2 different emperors, just to have this administrative effectiveness and efficiency. But even that did not help. So by the end of 4th century, after the death of Emperor Theodosius I, they decided to split the empire into 2 independent states. So from there onward, these 2 empires, they operated independently. Now, the split of Roman Empire helped Byzantium Empire, because after the collapse of Rome in the 5th century, it survived for a millennium, until when it was conquered by the Ottomans in the 15th century. By the beginning of the 5th century, Western Roman Empire started to crumble from within, due to the same problem that I've just mentioned. And now there was a rivalry between the East and the West. So the lowest moment of their history was towards the end of the 5th century, when external forces, these barbarian forces of Germanic tribe, they invaded the Western Roman Empire. And the Western Roman Empire sustained a lot of military losses. Rome had been entangled with barbarian forces before, and some of these barbarians, they were even made as citizens of the Roman Empire. But this particular time, you had three tribes. You have Visigoths and Ostrogoths who came from the north, and you had the Vandals who came from the south. They all converged towards Rome. They ransacked the city of Rome, and it fell in 476. There was also an internal revolt by Germanic leader Odoacer, and he deposed the emperor, and he abolished the Roman Empire. Uh, from there onward, no Roman Empire will rule a post in Italy. And that was the end of Western Roman Empire, how it collapsed. Now, from there onwards, Western Europe was now ruled by barbarian monarchs. All right, they became small states. These new Germanic rulers, they were uncivilized. They were tribal nomadic warriors who did not care much about civilization, about culture, about learning, and that's the reason they destroyed Rome, because the Western Roman Empire was an extension of the Greek civilization. And thus explains why Europe quickly plunged into the Dark Age, the period that in European history when Europe lost completely its entire urban life, city life, institutions of learning and culture, the intellectual connection to the ancient Greek philosophy. And Europe remained in the Dark Age for the next millennium, for the next 1,000 years, until when they discover Muslim knowledge in the 16th century and absorb these elements of Islamic civilization, sciences, and innovation. The main public square of the ancient Rome, the Forum, you can see the picture at the bottom on the left. This is the place where the Roman kings addressed Roman population. It reverted into agricultural and grazing area. What you see on the right. It became cow pasture, or the Campo Vaccino, as the Italian painter expresses. This is also true for most of other Western European cities, at that time. So Paris and London, they were not big cities anymore. They became, just like grazing areas, agricultural areas. Now, majority of the Western Europeans, they went back to simple village life, difficult rural life, without education, without healthcare, without culture, without sciences and technologies, all right? So this is what was the life like during this dark age. I compare the dark age, the European dark age, is the Western Jahiliyyah. This is a similar period, before Islam. Medieval life in the Western Europe during the dark age was harsh, with regular scarcities, famines, epidemic, endless wars, no rule of law, some immoralities as well, ignorance and barbarism. So there was no organized system of welfare. State welfare came to the West only in the 20th century. In contrast, state welfare was first established in the Muslim world in the 7th century during the time of Khalifa Umar. During the Dark Age, most of the Western Europe's public infrastructure also crumbled. For the most part, the road networks, the bridges, and public buildings were crippled because there was nobody to maintain them. In contrast, the Islamic civilization was primarily urban civilization, where cities played very critical role in shaping the civilization itself and shaping sciences and culture. And great Muslim cities enjoy all modern amenities that you can think of, like running water, extensive road network, paved and lighted streets. Municipality was working and security, people were living in peace and security. There were large multi-story buildings, public gardens, public baths, schools and universities, libraries, all of these amenities, hospitals that you will expect in a modern city. So that was the condition of Europe at the time Islam arrived. So by the time Islam arrived in the 7th century, what was remaining is these two big superpowers, the eastern part of the Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire or Byzantium Empire, and the Sasanian Empire, the Persians. And these two empires also, they were always in conflicts. And there was a big conflict that took place during the Prophet Muhammad's lifetime, and this was documented in the Quran in Surah Al-Rum. Eventually, both of these two empires will be conquered by Muslims gradually, and they'll be assimilated into the Muslim world. Now, so this is the situation. Islam, it arrived in the 7th century. And the arrival of Islam gave Muslim a very powerful, rational worldview. That's why they were able to spin off this beautiful civilization, because the Tawheed gave Muslims very rational worldview compared to all other beliefs that were available at that time. Islamic civilization, it established itself as a sacred civilization, as opposed to like the modern civilization, the Western civilization today is secular. It opposes religion, and it does not respect religion as such. Islamic civilization was a sacred civilization, rational. It was knowledge-based. It was a human focus. So people who talk about humanism, they have not really studied Islam, because Islamic civilization is really human focused. It is ethical based. A lot of emphasis in ethics, not only in prayers, but ethical, activities in all human endeavors. And it was, it has always been religious tolerant and cultural tolerant. The Western civilization, it is still learning to be tolerant, both in terms of religion and culture, and we can see this today. Islam did not experience tension between faith and reason, religion and science, or religion and philosophy, as in the case of Judeo-Christian tradition. And the Quran not only provided the essential teachings of Islamic principles and values for human salvation. It's not only focused on the akhirah, but it also inspired early Muslims to acquire knowledge and learning, and it gave them the spirit of rational investigation, discovery, and embrace of sciences and innovations. And it was the Quran that infused in the early Muslim the spirit of experimentation, observation, and measurement. And this is the basis of modern science. And it gave them that emotional power to succeed. So when we start to talk about the rise of Islamic civilization and sciences, a good starting point will be in Damascus, because here, after 3 decades of the reign of the 4 rightly guided caliphs, or Khulafa Rashidun, the Islamic Caliphate was now transformed into a dynasty. And the Umayyad dynasty was the first one to be established in 661 with its capital in Damascus. So now the capital of Islam was moved from Medina, where it was established by the Prophet Muhammad and his 4 rightly guided caliphs. Now it has moved to Damascus. Now, at this time, the Muslim landmass and population under Umayyad, it was large, very large, and it posed some challenges in the way to rule, the Muslim world at that time. So the Umayyads introduced many reforms in education and learning, in public administration and finance, in trade and commerce, in many areas, agriculture. They introduced many reforms. And it is during this period, the pursuit of science, it began in various fronts. And the reason, because the Umayyad, they were interested to find solutions to real life problems. Okay, so science was a vehicle for them to be able to help them to govern the, the Muslim world. So this is the period also there was the development of the major schools of jurisprudence. This is another intellectual activity. So it was not only science in a secular sense, but also science in religious studies. So this is the time where many schools of jurisprudence were established, systematic studies of the Prophet Hadith, it kicked off during this period, and Prophet's biographies, and jurisprudence methodology or usul al-fiqh, the study of usul al-fiqh started at this period. During the Umayyad time, you can say the Umayyad Mosque and the Dome of the Rocks are among the important architectural achievement of the Umayyad dynasty. The Umayyad Mosque was the first big mosque. The Prophet's Mosque in Medina, it was relatively smaller and simpler in its construction. And here, the Umayyad Mosque, the purpose, it was, to kind of posture this new civilization because, Damascus was very close to the Byzantium Empire, and it was a former part of Byzantium. And therefore, now Islam is presenting itself as a civilization to compete or to succeed those other civilizations. Now, Umayyad, by the time the Umayyad dynasty started, the whole of Arabian Peninsula, part of Iraq, part of Persia or Iran, what you call Iran today, also part of India, part of Pakistan, India and Pakistan, it was one block. Part of what is today Afghanistan, they were all, came to Islam during by the end of the four rightly guided caliphs. So Umayyad dynasty inherited that, but also territorial expansions continued during Umayyad time to North Africa, to Iberian Peninsula, which is this Muslim Spain, what became Andalusia, Eastern Anatolia, which is part of now Turkey, and Caucasus as well, these areas between the Black Sea and Caspian Sea, and part of Central Asia. And in the process of conquest and empire building, the Umayyads revived the ancient historical intellectual centers, the Hellenistic centers, which was closed by the Roman Catholic Church towards, fourth and end of 5th century. We talk about that in the previous talk. So places like, in Syria, in Merv, what is today Turkoman, and Sumerian in what is today Iraq, and many centers in Persia and in India, because now all this geography is under the one umbrella of the Umayyad dynasty. So not only they revived them, but they restored also ties so that they can have intellectual connection. Another major contribution of the Umayyad dynasty to the rise of Islamic civilization and sciences is the decision that was made by Abdul Malik ibn Marwan, Khalifa Abdul Malik ibn Marwan, to make Arabic as the lingua franca of the Muslim world. Okay, because this paved the way to make Arabic as international language of learning and science. So all these important intellectual centers that thrived across the region, from Edessa in Syria to the Iranian city of Jundishapur, Haran in Turkey, okay, and Merv in the Turkmenistan. All of these, they were revived and they started to flourish, and it offering the empire a formidable body of indigenous linguistic skills, philosophical and scientific talent, and knowledge of multiculture. So the Umayyad created that the right environment really to start the scientific progress. Now, the Umayyad were overthrown by the Abbasid in 750, mid 8th century. And the Abbasid, they moved the capital from Damascus to Baghdad. They built basically a new city of Baghdad. And Baghdad was quite innovative city when it was built. It was a circular shape. Initially, it was called Madinat al-Salam, and then it was renamed to Baghdad, and it was meant really to compete and to overshadow Damascus. Baghdad was strategically selected and located because it is between the two rivers, Tigris and Euphrates, and the rivers always provided, energy for civilizations. And therefore, it was an ideal spot for trade and cultural exchange and intellectual exchange as well, socio-economic development, food production, and it was meant to sustain a very large population. Now, what is important is at the epicenter of Baghdad, it was this royal academy that came to be known House of Wisdom or Beit al-Hikmah, and this place became the venue of a massive translation movement that took place in the 8th and 9th century to translate ancient knowledge into Arabic. Now, the Abbasids, they gave a big push to sciences and learning during the Islamic history. Many of the Abbasid rulers, they were great patrons of sciences. They wanted to create an intellectual culture that rivaled that of classical Babylon and the classical Greece. So the Abbasid really, they had a vision, to develop this civilization. Now, just to highlight a little bit about Beit al-Hikmah, because Baghdad boasted itself with this top intellectual center of that time of the day, the House of Wisdom of Beit al-Hikmah. It is a learning center. It was a brainchild of Abbasid rulers, as I said, but it grew very large during the time of Khalifa al-Mamun in the early 9th century. And Mamun, he brought and supported financially the top scholars from all over the Muslim world. He picked them, in the ones who were in Syria, in Persia, in India, everywhere. And he brought them in one place, and he kept them under one roof. And the center was also augmented with whatever that they needed in terms of resources. There was a huge multilingual library, and there was a huge astronomical observatory center as well. The center was drawing manuscripts from all ancient civilization, from Greek, from Persian, from Indian, civilization, from Chinese, in various fields. And they were being systematically translated into Arabic. They were studied, they were critiqued, and some new ideas were being built from them. Now, some of the famous Greek works, like Ptolemy's astronomy, or Galen's and Hippocrates' medicine, Euclid's geometry, Pythagoras, and some of these philosophers, Aristotle and Plato, all these works were now available in Arabic. Not only they were available in Arabic, but they were critiqued as well. They were writing commentary on this work. And just for you to appreciate, the translation work, we're not talking about linguistic translation only, because, any one of us who is bilingual, let's say, if you speak English and Arabic, and if you are given a manuscript of medicine in English, and if you are asked to translate into Arabic, if you didn't have a medical background, you will not be able to do it. All right, it's not possible, because you will not make sense the concepts, you will not make sense the terminology. So this translation work is, because the word translation sometimes simplifies it, is much, much more than that. Now, scholars at the House of Wisdom accumulated the greatest collection of world knowledge. It means that they had much better world view of this knowledge, because of, they could see the differences. They look at data that was collected from the Indian, sources, as opposed to the Persian sources or to the Greek sources, and they could make out the difference. To some extent, I think they had to start from zero, because with all these differences, they had to start fresh. And this, whatever that they did at that time, whatever they accumulated at that time, it really became the foundation of modern sciences and modern world. Now, as time went on, the centralized authority of Baghdad devolved to new independent centers of power and learning across the Muslim world. Institutions of learning and research, they sprang up across the Muslim world to rival each other. Knowledge seekers from all over the known world, they benefited from learning hubs. There were so many hubs, Baghdad, Damascus, Bukhara, Fez, Shiraz, many places, all right? Polymath figures, these are intellectual thinkers who specialize in multidisciplines, such as Al-Kindi, Farabi, Ibn al-Haytham, al-Biruni, al-Khawarizmi. They shone like stars in the sky with new ideas and innovations. And Baghdad itself, it became a cosmopolitan, modern metropolis and a center of learning and culture with plenty of wealth and opportunities. And it attracted, a lot of talents from all over the known world. By the 9th and 10th century, if you wanted to read classical Greek works, for example, such as the work of Aristotle and Plato, or Ptolemy, or Galen, or Hippocrates, you could not do it in Europe, because it was not available. It was only available in Arabic and in the Muslim world. Most of whatever that was remained with the Greek manuscripts, they had already vanished in the West. So if they wanted to read, they need to go to the Muslim world, and they need to learn Arabic in order to learn this. So all the intellectual activities on all areas, philosophy, astronomy, medicine, and sciences in general, they were going on in the Muslim world, and they were conducted in Arabic. And Arabic became the international language of scholarship. The Abbasid period probably represented the Muslims' golden age in terms of intellectual activities, sciences, and innovation. And it was also a good, modern, prosperous living as well. Just to quote a 13th century Arab historian and geographer, Yaqut al-Hammawi, he wrote this. He said, the city of Baghdad was covered with parks, gardens, villas, and beautiful promenades, and plentiful supplied with rich bazaars and finely mosques and baths, stretched for a considerable distance on both sides of the river. Now, in the early 10th century, there was a group of Ismailis from the Shia school of jurisprudence from North Africa who declared Abdullah al-Mahdi, or Ubaidullah, as the new caliph. And Abdullah al-Mahdi was claimed to have descended from the Prophet's daughter Fatima, for which reason they called themselves Fatimids. So this is the establishment of Fatimid dynasty. By middle of 10th century, uh, they directly challenged the authority of the Abbasid, and they seized Egypt, which was once a very important economic and cultural center of the Abbasid. And from Egypt, the Fatimid, they were well situated to compete in the Mediterranean sea trade. And the Fatimid extended their caliphate, and they included North Africa, and also they entered Europe in Sicily and Malta and some other islands in Mediterranean. Palermo, which is the capital city of Sicily, it became a vital Muslim city and intellectual hub in Europe, in the same way as Cordoba became in Andalusia, and we'll talk about the Andalusia, inshallah. That will soon be another important point of contact with the West. The Fatimid also established a new city of Cairo. The Arabic word for Cairo is victory, which gave them the resource of the agriculture of the Nile Valley to draw upon. Cairo was built as a large and modern city with good city planning when it was built, robust infrastructure, and the busy bazaars. They had the very liberal policies and a lot of cultural activities. The Fatimid built the world's second university in the 10th century, towards the end of 10th century, Al-Azhar. The first one was built in Fez by a lady, Fatima Al-Fihri. We'll talk about that when we have a talk about education. Soon it became an important center of learning in the Islamic world for both religious and natural sciences. Now, under Fatimids, Egypt enjoyed enormous prosperity, primarily because of the lucrative trade between Mediterranean and Indian at that time. So Cairo soon it rivaled the capital of Baghdad, the Abbasid capital of Baghdad. And also these Fatimid rulers, they practiced luxury living, and they triggered a renaissance in the decorative arts. And you can see that in Egypt, in the city of Fustat. It became a major center of production of pottery, glass, crystals, metalwork, ivory and wood carving, and textile factories. And the artwork from this period exemplified the creativity and ingenuity of Fatimid craftsmen. When I was researching this, you see this this glass pot, the picture of the glass pot. This from the Fatimid dynasty. It was sold in England for 2.2 million pounds. Amazing. The Fatimid dynasty was defeated in 12th century, early 12th century, by Salahuddin al-Ayyubi. Now, this is the map of Fatimid dynasty at its peak, and the purple, it shows the areas extended for Fatimid dynasty. At some point, they even took part of the Arabian Peninsula, and you can see the Sicily over there in Europe. But what is interesting is you need to remember these three dynasties, they were coexisting simultaneously. The Abbasid, which is centered in Baghdad, and there was Umayyad Caliphate dynasty in Cordoba, in Andalus, all right, centered in Cordoba. They kind of existed at the same time. The Palermo in Sicily was a very important Islamic intellectual hub. I already said that. Later, it became a venue for transfer of Islamic knowledge, sciences, and innovation to the Western Europe through personal contacts. Also, European, they used to send the people there to study, so study scholarship, and through translation centers. The fall of Sicily to the Norman kingdom in the 12th century, it followed Andalusian pattern. The Norman dynasty that ruled over southern Italy, they took the opportunity to invade the island in 1052 when they saw weakness in Sicilian Muslim, and they saw division among themselves, and they could not defend the island, and they could not get support from North Africa, because in North Africa also there was a preoccupation with some kind of tribal wars or civil wars. So by the beginning of the 12th century, most of the island was under Norman control. Palermo, it fell in 1072, Syracuse in 1085, and this coincidentally, it also, there is Andalusian city of Toledo, we'll talk about it, very important. It fell to Castilian kingdom. Most of these attacks, actually, they were coordinated. And the final outpost of Islamic control in Sicily is this city of Noto, which fell in 1090. Like in Andalus, a Muslim population continued to live under Christian rule, and treatment of the Muslims was dependent on the aims and temperament of the Norman kings in power at that time. And the reign of Roger II was particularly considered as the most tolerant, because Roger II was considered much more appreciative to Islamic civilization. Some people, they will consider him a friend of Muslims. Now, when the Umayyads were overthrown by the Abbasid in the mid of 8th century in Damascus, there was one Umayyad Amir, Abdul Rahman I, who managed to escape to South Spain. And he established an independent Umayyad Caliphate in Cordoba in 756. So Andalusia under the Umayyad excelled in intellectual fields as in other Muslim centers of learning in all areas, you know. And Andalusia also produced many polymaths, you know, thinkers with multi-disciplines. So you had people like Zahrawi, who was the father of medical surgery, Ibn Hazm, Ibn Rushd, Zarqali, who was an astronomer. The Umayyads in Andalusia, they lasted until 1492, during the last Reconquista. Okay, and Reconquista is to reconquer. You know, this is the word they use, Spanish, to reconquer, because they felt the Muslim conquered Spain, and therefore they need to reconquer. So 1492 is the fall of Granada to Isabella and Ferdinand, and it followed Inquisition, which drove the last Muslim out of Spain. Inquisition is a process the Spaniard, the Christians, they used to convert by force Muslims, or the acts of violence, they killed them, and if they resisted, they dropped them out of Spain. And Spain became illegal to be a Muslim from 15th century until a relief came in the 19th century, 20th century. You know, in between, it was illegal to be a Muslim in Spain. Now, the Great Mosque of Cordoba, Alhambra Palace, and Medinat al-Zahra are among the most architectural achievements of Umayyad in Spain. And when we talk about the contribution of Muslims in area of architecture, we will visit these monuments again. Baghdad, the 9th century Baghdad and the 10th century Cordoba, they were considered like wonders of the world at the time. You know, considering Europe is in the Dark Age, Baghdad and Cordoba, they were the most civilized cities in the world, wealthy, trendy, and magnets to intellectual and cultural minds. So when rulers of these barbarian rulers of France and England and Italy, when they need a consultant or a surgeon or an architect or even a dressmaker, they will contact Baghdad or Cordoba. In the same way today, many of Muslim countries, when they want expertise, they will go to the West. Life in the 9th and 10th century Baghdad and Cordoba was a pleasurable experience, and we have a lot of writings, you know, that explain how the cities were and how life was. The cities were well planned. They were built in stone houses and palaces. They had lighted paved streets. They had running water. There were plenty of universities and huge libraries. When libraries were, the idea of library and bookshop, it was non-existence in the West at that time. Hospital as well and pharmacy. These things didn't exist in the West. All right. They had to learn this from the Muslims. So even garbage was collected on regular basis, and some areas they had underground sewage system. Yeah, even today in this time, there are many places here that we don't have underground sewage system. So this is showing the map of the Caliphate of Cordoba. The green area is the Caliphate of Cordoba, and the top area, these are different tribes, Christian tribes from the north who are independent because they resisted Muslim conquest or opening. Unfortunately, the Caliphate of Cordoba did not last for very long. It lasted for 250 years, and it collapsed in 1031. And the reason it collapsed because of internal conflicts, as usual. Muslim, always don't agree with each other. The Caliphate of Cordoba, it split into 24 taifas, city-states. And these city-states were very weak because they were overstated as states. They could not, most of the time, they could not defend themselves independently. So the breakup of the caliphate, it weakened the Muslims and provided ideal condition to the Christians of the north to grab Muslim territories. And as they grab territories, of course, they grab the Muslim knowledge as well, because they will take the universities, the institutions, the industries, and all that other facilities. So Christian rulers from the north, they initiated this conquest or reconquest, whatever you like to call it, attacks that will last for 500 years plus. Toledo was the first one to fall, that big chunk that you see at the center. So Toledo is a very important name to remember, in the history of Islamic civilization. Toledo was the first to fall into Christian hands in 1085, which had a decisive impact on the history of Islamic civilization and the rise of Europeans as well, because Christians were astounded by the extent of Islamic civilization, and they were overwhelmed by the sheer number of books they saw in Toledo for the first time. People even they had their private libraries. In Cordoba, I know in Cordoba, the rulers, they had a library so big, when you look at even by today's standard, the library was so big. We're talking about close to 1 million books at that time. And we're talking about a time when there were no printing press, there were no desktop publishing, there were no Xerox machine. These books, they have to be copied by, each copy has to be written down by hand. So the Reconquista, as I said, this was a period in history of Iberian Peninsula of about 500 years, from the fall of Toledo, 1085, to the fall of the last kingdom, Nasrid kingdom of Granada in 1492. And the northern Castilian kingdom took advantage of the breakup of the Cordoban Caliphate. So constantly they were taking the Muslim territories. And as you can see, these pictures, if you look into the top picture from the left, by 1031, look at the difference, the contrast between the yellow region and the green region. As time unfolds, the green region, it was marginalized until by 1300, in the 14th century, the beginning of 14th century, what was remaining is only Granada, and even Granada, it fell in 1492. Okay, so as northern Castilians gained Muslim territory, they also gained Muslim knowledge and learning institutions, books and libraries, innovations and research centers, and industries and crafts as well. All right. So Toledo is very important because Toledo is the real birthplace of Renaissance or European Renaissance. It's not Italy, it's not Florence, as as the Europeans claim. The real birth or place of European Renaissance, it was here in Toledo, because here the Christian West, they knew the significance of Muslim learning and sciences, and their eagerness to appropriate Muslim knowledge, it began in this 12th century after the fall of Toledo. So reconquista of Muslim lands and requisition of Muslim knowledge, it went always hand in hand. And there was a massive translation movement of Muslim scientific and philosophical works from Arabic to Latin, which took place in Toledo in the 12th and 13th century. Among the most famous one, Christian European intellectuals who learned and mastered Arabic language for the purpose of translation. We know the names, and we have their history and the work that they did. Okay, so just to to highlight some of the names, like Robert of Chester, very famous, Gerard of Cremona, Daniel of Montley. These are all known if you Google, and you can read their histories and what they have done. Robert of Caton, I think he also translated the Quran, the first person to translate the Quran in European language, in Latin. And you can see most of these activities happen in the 12th and 13th century. All of them, they live in 12th and 13th century. Just to quote this historian, contemporary historian, E. Grant, who wrote The Foundation of Modern Science in the Middle Ages, he said Latin scholars in the 12th century were painfully aware that with respect to science and natural philosophy, their civilization was manifestly inferior to that of Islam. They faced an obvious choice, either to learn from their superiors or remain forever inferior. So they chose to learn and launch a massive effort to translate as many Arabic texts into Latin as was feasible. Also, this was a time in 12th century and 13th century, not only there was a massive translation movement of translating Arabic knowledge into Latin, but also establishment of the first universities or learning institutions in Europe. The traditional European centers of learning and culture, they were actually monasteries, and they were like islands or oases in a sea of ignorance and barbarism. The Greeks and the Romans, strange enough, had no universities in the same sense, the way we use the word, the meaning of university. So universities appeared in the Christian West only in the 12th century after the fall of Toledo. The fall of Toledo in 1085 gave Europeans access to the massive Muslim knowledge and culture, where they not only established translation centers to translate the knowledge, but also to transfer manuscript to other European cities where they could establish Muslim-style universities. And among the first universities to be established, it was Salano in Italy, in the beginning of 12th century, and it was followed by University of Bologna, also in Italy, and Paris towards end of 12th century. And then early 13th century, they established Oxford, and you can, people have written, case studies, Oxford being a very Islamic or Muslim university at its initial stage. And then followed by Cambridge, Angers in France, Padua in Italy, Montpellier in France, and Naples in Italy. Naples was established by Roger II, and he sought help from the Muslim to establish that university. Most of these universities, they will teach initially Islamic sciences, and they will teach Arabic, almost all of them, because that was the only thing that was available at that time. So following the steps of the Christian armies of Alfonso who conquered Toledo, Christian scholars also from many Western European countries and cities, they rushed down to Toledo to unearth the Muslim treasure chests of knowledge. Toledo, because it had amassed large amounts of scientific works. Now, although Toledo was the principal focal point for translation movement, but there were other centers as well in Spain, in France, in Italy, who did the same work. All right. Now, I want to quote also this another, contemporary historian who said, commenting about the treasure chest of learning from Muslim Spain, he said, brought about the excited discovery that it was indeed the Muslims who were the true representatives of classical knowledge and the giants on whose shoulders Latin science and philosophy had to be placed. This is the picture that you see on the left is a copy of a translation that was done from Muslim manuscript. Now, this picture really summarizes the genesis of Islamic sciences and philosophy. So on the left, when we talk about ancient knowledge, it was in Baghdad in the 8th and 9th century at the house of Beit al-Hikmah, where translation movement took place of the Greek, Latin knowledge, and as well as a Persian and Indian knowledge, and to some extent Chinese knowledge as well. And the Greeks, they got their knowledge from the Egyptians and the Babylonians. Okay, so I'm just stressing the source. Now, what the Muslim did, they did the translation. Okay, so this was involving critical analysis, commentaries, improvements, and new ideas, because there were some things that were not existing in the Greek, in ancient Greek, like algebra. It did not exist. So algebra is a new area that was discovered in Islam. Also chemistry, Greeks didn't have chemistry. Greeks didn't have trigonometry, for example. So these are new ideas also. And but it's not only the translation, because if it were only translation, we could not, have the scientific revolution as such. The scientific revolution and the modern scientific revolution, actually, it came because of the scientific methodology. This knowledge was existing all this time, but nothing happened. Nobody made any improvement for centuries, all right, on this knowledge. But it was the Muslim methodology that allowed actually, to kind of critique and to be able to produce some new ideas out of it. And therefore, this scientific methodology, including experimentation, observation, measurements, and verification. Now, in Toledo, this is what happened in 12th and 13th century. This was the beginning of the Europeans to have access to knowledge. And at this point, Europeans always they talk about the ancient knowledge as if the ancient, directly gave them the knowledge. But that was totally a different thing now, because this is not just the ancient knowledge. This is ancient knowledge with commentary, with improvement, with new ideas, but on top of it, with a scientific methodology. So I wanted to give this idea of like two bridges. The European, they had to cross two bridges. The bridge of translation and also a bridge of scientific method. And actually, we could put three bridges, also a bridge of new ideas. So the medieval Europe, they kind of struggle with this knowledge, but they didn't have yet, they didn't master it and have the confidence until in 17th century. So in 17th and 18th century, this knowledge was also translated into modern European languages. And the period between A and B is 500 years, and between B and C is another 500 years. And therefore, you're talking about between A and C, 1,000 years, a full millennium. We mentioned this in the previous talk that I'm running out of time. I hope Dr. Yusuf, you can give me 5 minutes. Uh, it's we mentioned that uh, the classical knowledge it was not it is a pre-scientific in a sense, because it was not really science as such. It was natural philosophy, because the Greeks they were theoreticians and the philosophers, but they were not experimental scientists. And experimental scientists is it really an invention that came from the Muslim. And the Muslim, if you read history of science today, the West, they claim that the modern scientific method, this idea of modern science is a European invention, and usually they attribute it to Roger Bacon, okay, in his famous work Opus Majus, or our or my optics. And then they also mention about Francis Bacon and René Descartes. But actually, the West pretends to be blind of the pivotal and original works of Muslim scholars in the field of scientific method and epistemological criticism that preceded the Renaissance for at least 500 years. And I can just cite some of the works, like Ibn al-Haytham. He wrote Doubts on Ptolemy. Zakaria Razi also, he wrote something on Doubts on Galen. Ibn Sina, he wrote on Demonstration or Al-Burhan. Al-Ghazali, he wrote Al-Munkid bin Al-Dalal, or Deliverance from Error. And Fakhruddin al-Razi also. So this idea of, intellectual doubts as a source, as a way to get knowledge, as a source of knowledge, it was not European. They took it from the Muslim. If you just look into the profile of Roger Bacon himself, the one that they attribute this idea to him. Now, Roger Bacon lived in the 13th century. And he was known in the West as being the most enlightened person of the medieval period in Christian Europe. But historians, they recognize him also as being a promoter of Muslim sciences in Europe. Not only promoter, but implementer as well. And if you look at his profile, he studied Arabic, and he studied Arabic sciences from Oxford and Paris, because at that time in Oxford and Paris, the only thing that you could study in terms of science is Muslim science, Arabic sciences, all right? And you needed to study Arabic because the manuscripts also, most of the work you will need to access in Arabic. So, and Bacon also concluded his studies in Cordoba. He went to Andalusia. Now, when he came back, because the church was very hostile to rationalism at that time, Bacon had to undergo imprisonment, like other famous, European thinkers. And it's interesting, this historian, a very authoritative historian, George Sutton, and Robert Briffault, both of them, they live in the previous centuries, have concluded that the Opus Majus, or his optics, is actually a Latin translation of Ibn al-Haytham magnum opus 7-volume Kitab al-Manadir, or Book of Optics. Now, today, most of the European, they will attribute optics, all right, to Isaac Newton. All right, if you pick any physics books, this is what it tells you. And to that matter, even Muslims, they kind of believe in that. But nobody talks about Ibn al-Haytham, who investigated virtually every aspect of light, every aspect of human sight, mirrors, lenses, even the idea that lenses can magnify. It was already established by Ibn al-Haytham. So Galileo, when he developed his telescope, he was fully using the knowledge of Ibn al-Haytham. In fact, Ibn al-Haytham, if he had lived long enough, probably he would have made the telescope. This is similar we find in other areas. For example, some of you who might have studied this in physics, Snell's law, which is it gives you the law of refraction. Many physics books today, or all physics books, they will attribute this to Snell and to Descartes. But in fact, this same thing you can go and read, from the work of Ibn Sahal, who died in 1000 years, and this work was done in end of 10th century, and exactly, he established this ratio, or this relationship. Uh, Ibn al-Haytham, he wrote 92 works. 60 survived, 16 on optics, of which 11 survived. And the book of optics is only one of them. There were many conflicting theories of optics that were inherited from the ancient Greeks, but Ibn al-Haytham, through meticulous experiment, he dispelled all of them. And Ibn al-Haytham optics work was holistic, because he not only studied in the optics, but he also involved geometry, anatomy, eyes anatomy, physiology, color, visualization, brain function. He also included work from the previous thinkers as well. In all his books, he meticulously described the experiments he conducted. So he's the first one to conduct experiments. The specific designs of equipment he used, and his observations and his conclusion. And his book, of course, was translated into Latin in the 12th century. This is a list of the books on optics, and the one in red, these are one that have disappeared. How do we know this? Because we make a reference from bibliographer Ibn Nadim, Fihrist of Ibn Nadim. He listed all the intellectuals who published in the 10th century onwards, and you can see that Ibn al-Haytham 7-volume magnum opus Kitab al-Manadir was read by all of these Europeans, Renaissance thinkers, and it is the basis of their work, both their work on optics and their work on scientific method. And I'm not going to read this, but Ibn al-Haytham, it just gives you an indication that, he studied all the aspects of vision, of optics. This is he was honored by this guy, Johannes Hevelius. He wrote this book that is called Selenographia, which basically it gives the surface maps of the moon, and diagrams of the moon, the craters. This is on the right. This is one of the page inside the book which shows the craters. He honored Ibn al-Haytham and Galileo, but look at what he does. If you look at closely on the platform where Galileo, who is on the left, it's written Al-Hasan, because his name actually is Abu Ali al-Hasan Ibn al-Haytham. So Al-Hasan is a Latinized name of Ibn al-Haytham. And there is a picture of a brain, and underneath he put it rational, meaning Ibn al-Haytham, he represents reason. But Galileo, he used the reason of Ibn al-Haytham, and he produced an instrument, and he represented it with the eye as a sense. So to end the talk, Ibn al-Haytham was the first scientist ever, the father of scientific method, which make him the father of modern science. And he was definitely the father of modern optics. Now, at last, in 2015, United Nations body of UNESCO, they honored Ibn al-Haytham for his immense contribution in the field of optics and physics. When they celebrated the Year of Light, 200 countries, they voted for his recognition and honor, which came after 1,000 years. And this is a quotation of from Ibn al-Haytham's book, Doubts on Ptolemy, listen to what he says, because shows that he established the scientific methodology 1,000 years ago. The seeker of truth is not one who studies the ancient writings and puts his trust in them, but rather the one who suspects them and questions what he gathers from them, the one who submits to argument and demonstration, and not the saying of human beings, which are subject of all kind of imperfection and deficiency. Thus, the duty of the man who investigates the writing of scientists, if learning the truth is his goal, is to make himself an enemy of all that he reads, applying his mind to attack it from every side. He should also suspect himself as he performs his critical examination to avoid falling into either prejudice or leniency. Shukran wa jazakumullah khairan.